I'm Sister Maria Simperman. I'm a religious of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and I serve on the synodality effort here at UISG. So I'm delighted to have you here. When we originally put this date on our calendar, we imagined that the instrumentum laboris for the synod would have already come forth. And alas and alack, it is coming out closer to July 10th. So to just respect the process of the synod, and that our initial contribution was to serve that, we are waiting until after the instrumentum laboris comes out, a day or two later, to put ours out as our contribution. Yet what we find in the document is that there's a lot in there that isn't only for the church, but that also speaks to consecrated life. And when people responded, they were offering us input about what the religious, the people in consecrated life, were sensing is the call for the synodal renewal of religious life also. And so what we are going to do today is I will begin by offering both a sense of the process we used and a good summary of key points that are in the document. And then we asked three of our sisters here, who are all leaders, to offer some commentary on the key areas and how they are implications for not only the church, but also religious life. So if the church is in need of renewal, which we are saying, this is a good time also for religious life and renewal. So we're going to hone in on some of those areas. So you'll get a sense of the whole in there. So we'll begin with prayer, and then I'll offer some input, and then we will hear from our three panelists. And so I'll just do a brief introduction before each one. And after everyone, we will have a little bit of silence. And then after the three, invite some silence and then some table conversation, and then also conversation on the chat. After that, we will open up the mics, both here in person and also online, because we can only do this together. And the implications and the invitations, and it's an important time to share with one another across places and experiences. And it's a gift to have done this with our brothers from UISG, and for them to be with their sisters in UISG. So we begin with prayer. And it's the prayer of the synod, and I think it's a call for our own renewal as well. So it's the Ad Summa Sanctus Spiritus. We stand before you, Holy Spirit.
Ad Summa Sanctus Spiritus, Ad Summa Sanctus Spiritus, veni ad nos ad esto nobis, veni ad nos ad esto nobis, ad Summa Sanctus Spiritus, ad Summa Sanctus Spiritus, veni ad nos ad esto nobis, veni ad nos ad esto nobis.
Siamo qui dinanzi a te, Spirito Santo, siamo tutti riuniti nel tuo nome, vieni a noi, assistici. Scendi the way we must go and how we ought to pursue it. We are weak and sinful. Do not let us promote disorder. Do not let ignorance lead us down the wrong path, nor partiality influence our actions. Let us find in you our unity, so that we may journey together to eternal life, and not stray from the way of truth and what is right.
Sumus Sancte Spiritus, Sumus Sancte Spiritus, veni ad nos ad esto nobis, veni ad nos ad esto nobis.
Nous te le demandons à toi, qui agis en tout temps et en tout lieu, dans la communion du Père et du Fils pour les siècles des siècles. Amen.
Sumus Sancte Spiritus, veni ad nos ad esto nobis, veni ad nos ad esto nobis, Sumus Sancte Spiritus, Sumus Sancte Spiritus.
Amen. The prayer is a prayer of a humble church, of a church that seeks to follow the movement of God in the midst of the world and among the people. And so we bring ourselves to that desire also as a church, as people of God. So what I'd like to do now is just, we're going to put the PowerPoint on. If we could put the PowerPoint on, perfect. So as we look at what's happening right now, and in light of the church's movements, we found ourselves at UISG and USG also invited after the Synod of October to respond to the Synod Synthesis Report. And to very specifically, the church asked us, how do we do authority, governance, and participation as religious? How do you manage unity in the midst of diversity? And how do you engage participation? And so those were very specific questions given to us. And so, in light of the whole document, we gathered a committee in January that met until mid-February to create the process that we would then send out to the church, to the UISG and USG members. And just to go forward a little, we were hoping if we invited 20-some people, we would get maybe 8. 22 people said yes to the invitation. And these are some of the people and not necessarily all of the people that met 3 different times to offer their input. And so what we did was create the questions that we thought were key for the church to hear and us to engage, but also we built in questions that we wanted to ask. I'll offer those in a moment. And then from mid-February until mid-April, all of you responded. And it was, for some, it was general councils. For some, it was also provincial teams. For some, it was also members. A few also said we're inviting some of our collaborators, partners in mission, to respond. So we had a lot of different inputs that came forth. In the mid-April to May 10th, a group of 4, you'll see that photo soon, met to read everything that came forth. And it was 2 men religious and 2 women religious, so that we would both look at things from our different perspectives and experiences, and then draft what we saw as the synthesis. And then again, and I think this just models the synodality we're seeking, we sent it out to the UISG members, and some of you were on that Zoom that read it and offered comments. And then I traveled to Assisi, where USG was meeting, and also received their comments. And so the document that came forth came really from everyone in this that went to the synod then, all right? The questions we asked were really about, what's your experience of growing in co-responsibility for mission? How does your community do communal discernment? What is the growing edge for you, and what have been the learnings about participation, authority, and governance? How do your structures right now either facilitate or hinder ways of co-responsibility for mission? What's your wisdom and experience of the participation of women in the church? And I must share that it was the men equally who were saying this is an important topic. And the church was also, it's in the Synod Response. And then what have been some of the examples of what you've learned from the richness of your cultural, racial, or ethnic diversity? And what difference has that made, right? And then the last was really looking at, how do you renew ministries? And because we are involved in ministry, how do we see the call of the church to do its renewal? And what new ministries are needed for this time? All right. So this is the group of 4 that were on the writing team. You have Orlando Torres, SJ, and Bayard, St. Ursula, Cristore Paredes, who's a Claretian, and myself. So we met for a good week and then met afterwards in addition. What you have in the Synod, in our contribution, are 5 themes that we found were coming through everywhere. Co-responsibility for mission, authority, governance, and participation, unity in diversity, the participation of women in the church, and how do we renew and strengthen both the bodies in the church, but also the ministries. What new is being called for at this time? So I'm going to offer you those 5 themes writ large with some of the details, not all of them, right? And then our panelists will offer some commentary on it. So co-responsibility for mission. Very interesting. Very early on, the acknowledgement was co-responsibility is not an important aspect, it's an essential aspect of a synodal church. And here, please translate these to a synodal religious life. What does it do? It fosters participation, communication, belonging, and communion, right? We had beautiful quotes coming forth that were just things like, I commit myself to be co-responsible for the mission and in living the charism. One of the pieces that was very clear was what works and doesn't work fits under the same rubric, creating time and space for mutual listening. Almost everywhere, what's needed? Listening, listening. We need to be listened to, we need to be heard, and we need to listen to the other as well. So it wasn't only to leadership, but it was to all membership, right? Another insight was that understanding of the women and men that we're blessed to work with. And that was that the sharing of ministry is not due to fewer religious, but to the recognition of the role of all the baptized in the church. It's not if we had more priests or if we had more sisters. It's because our baptismal call invites and moves us, and the world is in need of this. So a sense of working with rather than for. A real call to bring forth the young people, whether in religious life or in the church, early on for co-responsibility. That we're co-responsible also with the earth, right? A point in there about relationships between religious and the structures or the persons at the diocesan or local church level. We're all saying it all depends on the relationship with the priest, with the bishop, with the leader. So when it's a good relationship, things work well. When it's not, it doesn't. Another key area was about discernment and communal discernment. And we found both the groups who knew how their charism was able to work with them for discernment could articulate that quite well. And the call was to bring that to the local church, right? And to acknowledge that different charisms are different ways of discernment. An interesting point here, 2 points. One were on religious brothers. What came forth was a sense from our brothers that because they're not ordained, they can at times be almost invisible, dismissed, not included when there are events happening. The other very touching, tender space was from the contemplatives. And many of them felt that they're very much part of the local church. They're praying for it very specifically. People come to their communities, to their retreat centers for that sense of contemplation, but often they're not included in anything. And so a sense of we aren't trying to be visible, but we really belong in the visible part of the church. And so how to utilize this? And when you think about conversation in the spirit and the call to silence, I imagine our Cistercians can teach us something. I imagine our Benedictines can teach us something also about listening, and so forth and so forth. Right? The calls here, and I think the implications are for religious as well as the church. Leaders have a responsibility of calling forth the gifts of the entire community. That came forth everywhere, in a local church and also in community. What do we ask of our leaders? Call forth our gifts, invite them, and allow them to come. And a quote to just close this piece was that synodality is above all a culture that can be learned. It is not something that is unable to be learned. We can learn this, right? And we need to practice this. And in many ways, religious have, and yet we also have our growing edges. Second point, just offer 4 key small points about authority, governance, and participation. Again, the importance of creating spaces for the encounters. Where it worked well was when communities felt like we gave time to this. And we see this is going to change even our use of space and time. But that time and listening builds trust. Right? Second point was about communication and transparency across all levels of our governance structures, so that people on the ground, people in leadership, can hear from one another, can learn from one another. A real call was for ongoing formation for everyone. At the end, you'll see people were even saying, as much as we can to even do this together, including with the church. And this is going to invite us to learn how to deal with tensions in a healthy way, right? Third point, and we'll hear much more on this from Sister Sylvette, but what came forth about cultural diversity and unity in the midst of diversity was that we need to acknowledge the dominant cultures that may be prevailing, whether in our church or in our congregations. And that it's a difficulty, it's not easy. We have to face with openness and creativity the movement from acceptance and toleration to interculturality. It's a learning curve. And this includes cultural as well as generational diversity. But to see it as a reflection of the creativity of the Holy Spirit, a reflection of the creativity, right? And that we will need to examine our prejudices as well as look at what are our traditions and customs that are no longer appropriate, whether for clerical reasons or colonial reasons. What's our history? A lot came forth about the alliance of congregations with non-dominant groups. Sometimes the people made poor, sometimes the earth, sometimes indigenous persons. There was a lot of creativity across the globe. All of this has formation implication. And that an acknowledgement that cultural diversity finds its expression in the ways we exercise leadership, to acknowledge that, to notice that, in the way we interpret charism, and the way we reread our texts, including constitutions, in the way we live community and configure it, and in our ministries, right? So there was a lot there. Fourth point here was about women, participation of women in the life and mission of the church. The scripture that came through was Genesis 1:27 and Galatians 3:28, all looking at that God made us in God's image and likeness, and that there are many gifts, and it's one people, one body. And Lumen Gentium, that's really looking at how do we look at the gifts of the people of God, the church as the people of God, right? Early on was, from all that we were reading, a sense that we have different life experiences as women and men, and we deal with life experiences in diverse ways. That can be found anywhere. But everyone is needed, and the church needs many approaches to carry out her mission. And so the equal contribution of women and men is needed for the church's mission of evangelization, right? For the church's mission. And women being at the synod were one expression of this necessity and the gifts and charisms, right? And we had a gathering actually right here, and that's the picture on this slide. There was a real call for women's at decision-making processes at all levels of the church, both at the deliberative and the decision-making. So it wasn't only to consult, but to see how consultation is actually more than just give your thought and then do something else. So there was a lot of looking at consultative, deliberative. And how do we look at what are the obstacles that limit the participation of women in the church? What are the cultural, traditional, and institutional ones? And how do we engage those? And how do we design strategies, including canonical ones, to overcome the obstacles, right? From the local church, suggestions came preaching, including at Eucharist, teaching at seminaries, schools of theology, saying it's not equal in every country, but we need women in these areas. How do we acknowledge the needs in remote areas of the church, the needs for baptism, the needs for all kinds of ministries? And how do we do equitable remuneration? A number of responses spoke of women deacons and a call for this, and there were also some who spoke against it. So we had all of it. What came forth quite a bit, too, was the importance and a desire for inclusive language in our liturgies and in our texts. Right? The fifth, looking at renewal. What needs to be renewed and strengthened? The suggestions came at all levels, from the universal church to the local church. And they were saying, review the structures. Let's be more open, flexible, inclusive, sensitive to the needs of God's people. How can we create teams to promote the new synodal initiatives and in a synodal way? How do we implement those structures? There was a real call for accountability, evaluation. The ministry of listening and accompaniment came forth. Who are the persons who are often on the peripheries? And how do we find another way? Right? So migrants, LGBTQ, how do we encourage full participation of the people made poor? And a key here was the ongoing formation of all. And whenever possible, for this to be with laity, religious, priests, and bishops. And this came from the women as well as the men. So this is a broad summary of key points. This is the document that as soon as we are able to put it out, it's in our 4 languages. And so that it can be something for the renewal of religious life and a synodal renewal. You see in these elements of synodality. These are all key elements that we're bringing forth, right? Just to think way ahead, in September, we will look at the Instrumentum Laboris and offer, once we see it, the 3 sessions again, as we did last year, to help people prepare. And it's open to everyone in there. And the call is here for the whole people of God. So I pause now for a moment, and then I'll introduce our first panelist. But these are the 5 key themes. So our first panelist is Sister Mary Barron, the congregational leader of the Sisters of Our Lady of the Apostles. She is also the president of UISG. And so she's going to look at co-responsibility for mission and authority, governance, and participation, as they're very linked. So thank you. Thank you, Sister Mary.
So good afternoon to all who are here in the room, and good day to all online, the different time zones. So before focusing on the first 2 areas that Maria has just mentioned, I would simply like to set the context by saying firstly that it's important to remember that what we're presenting is in response to the question that was asked of religious life. We were being asked to share the wisdom that religious life can offer the church on this synodal journey. And I think we have a real responsibility to do that. And then secondly, as we examine our own way of being religious, perhaps it's difficult for us to appreciate how we have grown in our capacity to live synodally. For many of us, it has always been the culture of the religious life that we've known. I speak for myself. I've been in my congregation for 29 years. And I would say it's really been a very synodal experience of religious life. And of course, we are continuously being challenged to improve that. As someone used the beautiful phrase, we are constantly building the bridge as we're crossing it. And I think for religious life and synodality, we are constantly improving. But if we go back further in our history, I think it's very clear that we've made great strides in living synodality. And so it's this experience that we are asked to share, not just a snapshot of how we are today, but the growth, what has led us to be how synodal that we are today. That's just as set in the context. And I would say last year, I had an encounter with a bishop he was accompanying a general chapter of religious women. So he was there for the whole month with these religious women. And he said to me afterwards, he said, really, we in the hierarchical church, we're just dipping our toes into the waters of synodality. whereas you in religious life, you're swimming in the deep waters already, and we have much to learn from you. So I think it's not, as we say in Ireland, it's not for nothing that we are being asked to share our wisdom. So to speak a little bit about the first area, which is the co-responsibility for mission. And what has helped religious life really to grow in this area has been cultivating certain qualities. Maria mentioned some of them are here. Our willingness to learn, to always be open to learning something new, our capacity to communicate, our interdependence, etc., etc. And these key qualities, I think, go with anti-values. We cultivate certain qualities, and then we try to avoid certain anti-values that put the brakes on synodality, which is neglecting to care for our spiritual lives, abuse of power, too much attachment to money, and individualism. And what strikes me from these points that have emerged is the constant evolution of our capacity to live synodally. It's not just we're learning it and it's done. It's this, we have to be strategic in recognizing the areas of growth that are needed to help move us forward, to continually be moving forward. And I think if we look back over the past 50 years in religious life and highlight the areas that were to the fore in ongoing formation, I think we would see the foundations for the deeper synodality that we are living today. And so I think the challenge for us today is to identify what we need today in ongoing formation to keep us moving forward. Another key area in this co-responsibility for mission, and it's repeatedly emphasized in the document, is the need for space and time. And this is very countercultural, to create the space and the time to really listen to each other, and the value and the importance of listening to everybody. And it's repeatedly mentioned that to live synodality, this space and time is needed. So I think for all of us as religious today, I think there's a challenge there to really reflect on the type and the quality of the time and space that we devote to living synodally. It's not business as usual. We need to create those spaces. And then, as Maria mentioned there, this growing, and I think this really struck me, this growing sense of appreciation of the call of all the baptized to collaborate in the mission of God. It's not our mission as my congregation, it's not my congregation's mission, it's God's mission. We're all called to collaborate. And I think even though we may have been pushed to collaboration with lay people because of diminishing numbers in some cases, I think we have really grown in understanding the call of all the baptized to participate and collaborate in mission. But I see this as a growing edge. I think we have a long way to go. And likewise with our understanding of co-responsibility with the earth. This being co-responsible in mission, as it's said in the document, means accepting the ethical responsibility to address the climate crisis and to mobilize communities to protect the planet. For too long, humans have walked on the earth, and we are now at a moment where we realize that we have to journey with the earth. So I think we're growing in that sense of understanding of what it means to be co-responsible in mission with all of creation. But it's another area I think that's calling us forth. Another point that really struck me in this was the emphasis on discernment. And there are so many different ways of discerning. The different spiritual traditions have their own approaches to discernment. But as this document states, there are commonalities in all of these approaches, which include prayer, faith sharing, consultation, and consensus building. And for me, this is really a crucial dimension that we need to retrieve and we need to do better. and we need to honor it in all dimensions of our lives. I think sometimes maybe we only pay lip service to discernment. We go through the motions, but to truly, put God's will at the center of all that we are doing, I think it's a real call to us in our day, and it's a contribution to the church as a whole. Maria spoke there about the relationship also between the diocesan structures and religious. And this is another area where I feel, as religious, somehow perhaps we have to take the initiative. There can be strained relationships, it can be difficult. But synodality is rooted in relationships, in mutual respect, and building up those relationships. And I think sometimes maybe we don't take enough initiative to move towards the hierarchical church in a synodal way. And also, I think as leaders of congregations, we are very aware that, certainly, and I have become very aware that as a leader, one of my roles is in creating the space and in calling forth the giftedness of all the members. And I think that we have to help church to assume that responsibility, to call forth the giftedness of all the baptized. I had a very interesting experience last week. I was in Tanzania, and we had a day on synodality with our OLA sisters and our collaborators. And it was really fascinating. It was a very good response. There was a big crowd, mostly lay people. But one of their complaints was they've been involved in the process, but they're not hearing any feedback. So the lack of communication, the lack of transparency in the process for them was a frustration. So I think we create the spaces to participate, but we must also follow through in the entire process and journey with, communicate, be transparent in the entire process. Of course, Maria mentioned there's a whole chapter dedicated to it. We'll hear about it later. But there is always the echo of the need for the inclusion of women to be an authentic expression of church. And again, I think as religious, we're to the fore in challenging, and I think we need to continue and add our voice strongly to that in all dimensions. One part of this, it's the very last point here at the bottom of this slide. It really struck me where it spoke about the local church, that new pastors need to take the time to get to know the culture of the parish before making changes. It just really struck me as, as missionaries, we're a missionary congregation, when we go, it's the first thing we say, take the time to get to know the people, to learn the language, to live with, before you think about what you're going to do. And I think that's a real learning, I think, that we can bring to the church, to the wider church also. That's mostly about the co-responsibility. As Maria said, the two areas are very related. To me, I see them as two sides of the one coin. So I don't want to say too much about the authority, governance, and participation, except to speak about the clarity of roles. I think that's a very important point that comes across in the document. And I think from religious life, we're very clear about who takes the decisions in the end and who is involved. And I think it's something that when there's clarity, people participate, quite happily, knowing the structures that are there to take the decisions and to participate as we go along. So I think that's something that's very important. And the final part that I want to talk a little bit about is it's a cultural change for church. And I think we have to approach it as such and realize that to change any culture in any organization, it's a very long-term project. We need to have the patience to journey. We need to have the humility to continue offering the wisdom, even if it's been rejected, even if it's maybe not been well understood. But I think we also, to ourselves, we have to be very humble in how we offer and in how we journey with. So it was also something that one of the laymen in Tanzania last week, at the end, he was referring to the fact that so much revolves around the parish priest. And if the parish priest isn't committed, then nothing happens. And his question was, is it possible for them to change? You know, there's so much conversion needed. Is this possible? And for me, like, my answer to him was, of course it's possible. You know, with the grace of God, everything is possible. But we have to keep chipping away, keep challenging, keep journeying. And I think once we have a critical mass of people committed and understanding, we will move forward in this process. So I think that keeping that perspective of cultural change and all that that demands, I think will help us as we move forward. So that's what I would like to offer in relation to those two. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. We'll just take a moment to pause and reflect on what we heard and what draws us. Our second panelist is online with us, and it's Sister Sylvette Mann, who is a Marist sister and is the president, the superior general of the Marist Sisters. And she comes from Senegal, but is in Italy at another location. And she will be speaking in French so that you have your language attunement. Merci beaucoup. Bonsoir.
Good evening, Maria and everybody, and thank you for your introduction to the document. This document that gathers all the contributions of many congregations, male and women congregations, where we participated also, and in order to express which is our contribution to this process in the church. Before beginning with the point 3, that is my contribution, or the synthesis that I will present, before doing that, I would like to express my appreciation of the introduction of Maria and then Mary, that also shared the first section of the contribution. So I would like to say that the synodal process to which the Church is inviting us is an old and familiar practice, but today one needs a facelift because the reality is changing. As all the experiences, we have to reread this practice and redefine it with openness, sincerity, and desire to grow. Communion, participation, and mission, the three pillars of this journey, have given us the opportunity to bring the unique contribution of each congregation, which together with other contributions from other congregations forms an unprecedented richness. So I'd like to focus on one aspect of our rich cultural diversity, and that comes from the general reflection, that is our cultural diversity that is so rich. The cultural differences have always existed and have been experienced and welcomed according to the means and circumstances of each era or time. Today, when we speak of diversity and interculturality, we want to consider our current world that is evolving and changing at a huge speed in terms of demographics, new technologies, social, economic, and political life. And for those who are in Europe, we can see the political evolution also. This rapid change doesn't often leave us the time or opportunity to stop and look, contemplate, and welcome and reach out and let ourselves be challenged and transcended and transformed so that we can journey together without prejudices, offering our word the ever renewed life that the Lord expects from us with our diversity and its richness. This huge evolution of our society affects our religious institutes. We generally experience this diversity in a spirit of gratitude, but also with all its challenges. And many structures in the church are living this diversity as a richness, but without seeing the challenges and the transformation that is needed, the conversion that is needed, that has to grow in order to give life. The universal mission of the founding charism of each institute is a challenge that each institute meets and seeks to preserve faithfully, of course. And this charism is universal because it is based on Christ, the universal for excellence. But whatever the place and the people who live and witness this charism, they have inevitably a cultural coloration according to each person's unique mode of expression. My congregation today is living in a very different way than 200 years ago. But the heart of our charism is the same, and we try to keep it. So this mode, this style of changes, that is the beauty because it has the contribution of each one of us. And as St. Paul tells us, we are all quenched by one spirit. That we are, because we are all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slaves or free men. And that is our identity in each institute. It doesn't matter the diversity in our cultures, we have our source in our charism. The second point that I would like to highlight is the demographics that are changing, increasingly changing in our congregations, in the church, etc. We are welcoming into our midst new members from different cultures and cultural backgrounds and languages. But we share the same mission within the same religious family, and that is our motivation to journey together to fulfill the congregation's mission beyond cultural differences without prejudices. In spite of all, we come to the congregation with what we are, but we can transform that in when meeting others. And the community, our communities in the church, becomes the place where we learn, and I would like to highlight this because the document talks about the learning. So it's not that we accept, we welcome the differences. And this exercise is both a stimulating and painful step towards a better future, because we all want a better future. The next point that I would like to highlight is that in this learning, we learn to know ourselves and to accept one another. And living together exposes us and expose our weaknesses, the weaknesses of the members of an institute, our poor humanity. And this can lead to considerations that are very human and that slow down the development of an institution's mission and its unique gift to the church and to the world. And that is our human condition that we have to accept, to welcome, and go beyond as in synodality, all together. Another point that the document highlights, it's in relation with the dominant cultures and the dominated cultures. And Maria has already talked about that and colonial cultures. Yes, we have all had, we have received the formation that came from other cultures with what they had, the best, and also with other realities that help us to reflect and to move to conversion altogether and to move forward. So these dominant or dominated cultures in the different structures of the church have to face the reality of interculturality. We have to work all together towards that reality. Our word today, it's a global village that calls us to an inner displacement, to enrich ourselves and offer to our word, our witness to the whole world. Welcoming, respecting the difference as a richness of inconsecrated life. So this will of being all together, it's something that it's a phase of transformation to better serve the mission. And we are living that in the different groups in order to, we are living this phase of transformation inner and exterior transformation to better serve the mission. The following point that I would like to highlight that is coming from the Synod logo of where you have a group of people working together and not without its difficulties. It means that there are always difficulties. And looking to that image, I can see some difficulties which, if not integrated, can interfere with the running of the group. Different rhythms, limited energies, handicaps that are more or less clear, ambitions, jealousy, or desire to compete, or prejudices, racial prejudices. And by focusing on these imperfections and shortcomings, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to live the common mission. And it's there where we have to go beyond those imperfections or limits in order to accept the richness of our diversity. The following point that I want to highlight is to accept that we have to accept to enter into a process of integration that transforms the relationships. We have to welcome and integrate that is deeper. And this process of transformation of the relationships and that humanizes communications and enhances individual and diverse contributions for the good of the common mission. And that attitude, that it's a Christian attitude that we are invited to, and it helps us to move from jealousy to the praise of complementarity. Praise of complementarity. We have to thank the Lord for our differences because we can complete one another in that differences. The last point that I would like just to mention is that this integration is not only for the human relations or the institutions and the church. That goes beyond to all the different minorities that are around us, the refugees, the Aboriginal people, the relation with brothers and sisters, Christian brothers and sisters, relations with people of other religions. I am coming from Senegal, a country where the majority of the population is a Muslim population. We are in minority, and we want to offer a witness of life through our works in education, health, and our different ministries, so that our brothers and Muslim brothers and sisters can see our witness because they see that we are trying to be authentic and there is a richness in what we do. And to me, that is an example of integration that could help us in the church. And beyond this integration, we also embrace our earth, the environment. Laudato Si invited us to that. And the Pope called us to be promoters of this respect of our environment and Mother Earth. And to finish, I would like to say that the invitation is to enlarge, to continue to enlarge our tent that was at the beginning of the synodal process, and continue learning of, and this unity in integrated and integral diversity is the new sap, the refined oil of a dynamic synodal journey for a church that is enriched by the contribution of God's children of all cultures, races, and generations all together. So that is my contribution on the third section of the work that we have done with the contribution of all the congregations in order to offer to our church our small contribution in this synodal journey that we are engaged in. This is, Maria, what I could do and developed. Thank you very much.
Merci, my dear sister Sylvette, for your way of reminding us that synodality and unity and diversity are linked, and as also Mary spoke, that there's a conversion needed, and there needs to be practices that go with the conversion. And so thank you for widening the space of our tent as well, and Mary deepening our sense of what's being asked of us at this time in all of our relationships. We'll take a brief pause to just soak this in. And our third panelist is familiar to everyone. Nevertheless, we'll introduce Sister Pat Murray, member of the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and she is the UISG Executive Secretary. And she will gift us with some reflections on that fourth and fifth section, looking at ministry and women and their calls, and also what the expansiveness is that is calling to us as a synodal church and synodal religious life. So, Pat, please, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Maria. Sections 4 and 5 are actually very detailed with lots of suggestions, and you'll find some overlap in what I'm saying because they've been mentioned already in sections 1 to 3. But beginning with the section on the participation of women in the life and mission of the Synodal Church, the biblical citations which are provided stress the basis for equal participation and the equal dignity of all the baptized, and the call to all to be involved. And I think we recognize that same desire for participation in our religious orders, in our religious congregations. I hear sisters again and again saying, we want to be involved at many different levels. And therefore, I think there's a challenge to leaders, both within the Synodal Church and synodal religious life, to develop means and mechanisms for participation and involvement. That will depend on the size of congregations and on the scope of congregations. But I think that desire is there. People really want to take ownership of whether it's the ministry, the congregation, the parish they belong to. Secondly, in this section, again, the different life experiences of women and men is emphasized. And I remember years ago being part of an educational project in the north of Ireland, producing a peace education program titled Our Differences Enrich Us. And just as we've heard in section 3, differences need to be nourished and appreciated. They're there, but it's not enough that they exist. They have to be nourished, appreciated, fostered, and used. And that's a challenge for every congregation and for every local church. We've passed from a model of religious life that concentrated on uniformity to one now that should cherish and nurture difference. And this is so important, as we've already heard, in our increased multicultural church and society and consecrated life, where we strive to understand what it means to be intercultural and then to live it. So the document refers to the diversity of gifts and charisms and sharing those gifts and charisms through collaboration and networking. And I go back to the Congress of 2005 called Passion for Christ, Passion for Humanity. If you have not read that document, you should read it, because it is kind of a fundamental text when you're looking at the evolution of consecrated life today. It called for a radical shift for intercongregational collaboration and for collaboration between lay and religious. It said a new paradigm was needed in religious life and in the church in general. And I think we religious women and men have increasingly engaged in trying to grapple and make real this new paradigm. I'm thinking of intercongregational and intercultural initiatives like Solidarity with South Sudan, ministries at borders throughout the world, intercongregational initiatives in the Amazon basin during COVID, many, many initiatives that religious women and men are engaging in. This, in a way, is the future, but it's also a model for the church to learn. There was an emphasis in section 4 on women taking up leadership roles, pointing out that women are already, in many parts of the world, in a variety of leadership roles in the corporate world, in politics, and so forth. Some years ago, I was on a panel here in Rome run by an organization called Humanity 2.0. And the members of that panel were women, a woman who was an astronaut, another who was a leader in a business corporation, an international lawyer, and somebody running a bank, and myself. Now, I use that as an example because I think conversations between women and across all these diverse competencies and capacities will enrich the church. Not only conversations between men and women, but conversations between women themselves who come with a faith perspective to the church and its life. That's a richness and a resource to be drawn on. And yes, women are beginning to occupy different roles and take up new opportunities within the church structure itself. But I also think that as religious congregations, we have to prepare sisters for these roles and for roles that are emerging. Both prepare lay women. That can be our contribution too, as religious orders, to educate lay women as well as educating sisters as lawyers, environmental scientists, social workers, engineers, community developers, but coming to these areas with a faith perspective and with a vision of the church today, trying to enable growth and development and the flourishing of all humankind. Proposals presented in section 4 suggest that women, lay and religious, need to take up executive responsibilities within the church, such as within parishes. Now, that's already happening in parts of the world, but it's often happening because there is an absence of clergy, rather than a choosing of the person who's best for administering the parish. So I think we have to think in new categories. It's not out of scarcity we should be making choices, but it's about of giftedness and competencies. That's a challenge for us because it's asking us to rethink parish leadership, also to rethink leadership within congregations, and to devise new collaborative models of leadership, new collaborative models of servant leadership. And I know in religious congregations in parts of the world, there's a challenge to find people to take up leadership roles. So are we looking at a time where religious and lay can assume some of those leadership roles together? Giving voice and visibility to women is essential in the church today. If women don't experience real active participation, they will walk away, as is sadly happening in many parts of the world. But it's not just taking up roles. And I think we find this in religious life today in many parts of the world. Those who are joining are not just coming for the works, they're coming for the spiritual resources of the congregation and for the community life. So these are new emphases that I think need to be brought into the synodal church, nurturing the spiritual life of people, not just the saying of prayers or the attending passively at Eucharist or services, but how to nourish at a personal level the relationship with Jesus, our Lord, and to help people enter into nurturing that personal relationship, because that's essential part of taking up a role. It's that you have the spiritual nourishment and energy to live out that role. I think as men and women participate together in the church, that will call for there are new experiences, new capacities being brought to the life of the church, but also new opportunities for change. Because the synodal method of deep, respectful listening and discerning the Spirit is only the beginning of a process that will require changes in systems and structures. So in a sense, it's a relational way of sharing how God's Spirit is acting and calling us, but calling us to a change in how we relate and then how we structure relationships. This isn't just a change of structure for the sake of changing structures, but how do we mirror and live out that co-responsibility for the mission in the church? I think there are cultures and contexts where women have already demonstrated extraordinary leadership, both lay women and religious sisters. And often these are in the context of war or conflict or very demanding situations. So I believe that examples of the leadership of women, particularly from the basis of their faith, need to be raised up in a world that requires healing, and transformation. Often these types of examples are little known, and I think we in religious congregations aren't the best examples ourselves, because we often don't tell the stories that need to be told out of maybe a false sense of humility. We need to tell the stories, both of past and present, of where women, lay and religious, are making a difference. The document stresses again and again education, formation, communication, and that these are essential tools for cultural transformation if we are to promote the equal dignity and the complementarity of men and women in the church. And we all have a responsibility to take that on board, to take on board education, formation, and communication, not just for ourselves, but for those who are our partners and collaborators, those in whose neighborhoods we live, whom we can invite to be part of this transformative process. There's a call in the document for lay men and women to preach at Eucharistic celebrations. Obviously, formation is required, but so many are now well-trained theologically and also are excellent communicators. So we in our religious congregations can begin this process of giving space for preaching so that we hear people speaking from different contexts and different life experiences and provide different types of nourishment in our Eucharistic and in our paraliturgical celebrations. Again, the document talks about the role of women in spiritual accompaniment as spiritual directors, as retreat directors. This is beginning in parts of the world, but again, in large parts of the world, women do not act in this capacity. Can we as religious congregations see this as an invitation both for training and for formation of our own members, but also of other women and men? Women, both religious and lay, serve in remote areas. And the document speaks about raising up new ministries in peripheral areas, and that these pastoral roles need to be made perhaps more formal, but affirmed strongly. And these ministries are often with the marginalized and those migrants and refugees, those who are trafficked, and so forth. These are essential ministries in the world today. But they are ministries that need to be remunerated. And that the church needs to, and we need to, affirm that such ministries must be supported financially and resourced in other ways, resourced through formation and training. Again, I see a real call for us as religious that we're working with, that we look at our own language and we see our lay collaborators as co-responsible with us for the ministries in which we are engaged. They are not working for us, they are working with us. Together we are serving the Missio Dei in today's world. I think there's a huge misconception within the laity that somehow remuneration is given to religious sisters for the work that they do in serving in all sorts of different contexts. And that is not the case. And therefore, I think we need a whole new appreciation within the church that together we support the ministries that are needed, lay and religious at the parish level. For me, one of the challenges for religious congregations is, as we've grown bigger and more complex, perhaps we have grown more remote from our founding seedbed. You know, we were often founded in a local context by a small group of women who were supported by neighbours and family members. But as religious or congregations grew and expanded, perhaps that close affiliation has been lost, and that we have a task to do in terms of re-engaging and recommunicating and re-involving, that together it is we're on mission. The document mentions the matter of the permanent diaconate for women, and was raised many times by those who contributed. We're aware of the statement that Pope Francis has made recently in relation to the ordained diaconate for women. But it's also a topic that is being studied by one of the groups established after the first session of the Synod. So I'm sure it will surface again as we go through the second session. And in a discernment processes need time, need depth, need reflection. And it's clear that this and other issues, there will be many stages along the way as we search for God's Spirit and guidance at this time. Section 5 in the document has focused on co-responsibility of all the baptized, and that's key to all the matters raised in this section. There's a call for review, renewal of roles, of structures, of processes and models. And we as religious have experienced this kind of renewal since Vatican II. We've looked at roles, we've looked at structures and processes. We've examined new models of leadership or ministry. These are resources to be shared with the universal church. This is a task, though, that's continuous. It's continuous within our religious congregations. It started at Vatican II, and it's been an ongoing process. So this call in the document for the whole church to embark on a renewal process, it mentions at the level of the episcopacy, the presbyterate, the parish, and all church organizations. This is a radical step, and we've learned that it requires skilled preparation and facilitation, and it needs a whole church approach. We're already seeing the difficulties that arise when some parts of the church take on the task and challenge of becoming synodal and others do not. This can cause tension and fractures. So in a sense, there's a challenge for religious congregations, for parishes and dioceses to prepare synodal teams. I think we have to review all our roles, our structures, our systems and processes now from a synodal perspective. But the change has to be modeled by leaders. We've seen in consecrated life the importance of modeling by leadership. And the same is true in terms of Vatican dicasteries and bishops, so that it's clear that the formation and participation and inclusion of everyone is a value that we're all trying to live. So perhaps we need to continue in our religious congregation examining participation and co-responsibility, asking ourselves, do we need teams to lead this process? What organs or processes need to be created at this time in order to be synodal? The document refers to the relationship between bishops and religious. And there have been attempts to rewrite mutual relaciones, mutual relationships, which is the document that was prepared for, if you like, developing and looking at these relationships. But I think I would agree with Sister Mary Barron, saying perhaps what is needed first is to begin to build the relationships on the ground in a very practical way. To begin to build and renew relationships so that conversations can be had about the practical matters that need attention. Words like dialogue, new approaches to administration, greater participation are emphasized again and again. In our religious congregations, we try to make these part and parcel of who we are and how we live. Let us share these learnings at the local level, at the diocesan level, and at the universal level. And perhaps as I finish, the call in section 5 to establish new ministries in a more formal way, particularly those ministries dedicated to the elderly, street children, migrants, anti-trafficking, young people, the impact of the new technologies. I'm thinking of the digital missionaries who see a role for themselves in the world today. Perhaps we have to highlight to a greater extent the importance of these ministries by giving them some sort of formal recognition within church structures. In conclusion, we've learned as religious men and women, we've learned from experience that increased involvement brings increased commitment and increased ownership, and indeed increased love, both of our congregations, mission and ministry, and of the church and the mission of God in the world. But this requires formation and education, a formation and education that should and must be done together.
Thank you, Pat, and for really looking at that large call for religious life in this, and where is it that we're called to greater participation, but also where do we bring ourselves to also listening and inviting. So let's hold this with a pause of silence. There was a lot here. There's a lot. And what I'd like to invite you, both online and those who are present here, is to just reflect for a little bit, and we'll give some table conversation time, but also online chat time. And what I invite you to think about is, from what you heard, what synodal areas do you sense calling you, challenging you? What did you hear that's inviting and calling? So what are some of your thoughts? We're going from a review of structures in the church to the individual parish or local area, which is really reviewing the structures of our entire congregation to what is it like for the individual brother or sister. So give yourselves a few minutes to just think about what do you sense from all that's been offered is really a deep invitation to you, to religious life. We're going to allow just openness on the chat for a little bit and your own conversations. And then after about 5 minutes, we'll just invite from the group online and also from the people gathered here some of your thoughts, reflections, comments. Thank you. In these months, to try what this might look like. And so we're seeing here people saying in some congregations, we are able to open up preaching, that if you have a presider that's willing, that you can have others preach who are prepared. I do know that there have been examples since the Synod. One was in Washington, D.C., and one was in Chicago, where the pastor said, this is what the Synod Response document is offering. So I'm inviting on Feast of the Holy Family to have a family preach. And in another place for Lent, to have someone who preaches and teaches preaching to preach. So I think, as people said, maybe Pat said, we need to share the narratives of where this is happening and ways that this is happening. And that was actually one of the proposals when the whole people of God could send in responses of a group of preachers saying, could we consider Eucharistic and non-Eucharistic preaching? Could we look at this? So thank you to all of you that are writing about this, and also giving examples of Australia, women offering their preaching on the gospel. So there's a number of different ways to break open the word. So thank you for that. Do we have some comments or questions anybody would like to see offer? I'm going to need help from our tech people. If you raise your hand, please do so with the button on the Zoom. Or if there's anyone here, that says, this is resonating with me. We have someone online, Sean Peters. Could someone unmute? And so we look forward to hearing from you.
One of the challenges is the structures of the church do not support organizations and lay-led structures. If the pastor changes or the bishop changes, often those structures do not survive. And I was struck when, I think it was you, Maria, who said people are invited into the synodal process, but then they don't hear any more about it. And that also relates to lack of structures. We have the grace of UISG that allows us to hear these experiences and to learn more. But those kinds of organizations do not exist for other people. So I think it's that challenge.
Thank you for that. You're absolutely right, and that is coming up. That came up at the Synod. How do we create those change spaces, but also how do we participate? Communication and transparency and accountability are coming through everywhere, and a recognition really is that it comes from deep within our tradition. If you look at the Acts of the Apostles, when they journeyed and they came back, they were asked to give an accounting of where they have gone and what that meant. And so I think that is one of the growing edges. And you're right, in the local church to say a new person comes in and everything changes. It's this moment that we are in that we're hearing that. And I think the church structures, the people who are in charge of the church structures are also hearing that. I was in the Philippines in January, and it was in a mountain area. Somebody asked that question and then also said, can a bishop create a pastoral plan without talking to the people? And so that was, again, and I said, what a wonderful thing, because what we're hearing on the seeming peripheries is the center. And if you meet our brother bishops, they usually would prefer to have some assistance, right? And so I think a piece that both Sylvette was offering and Mary and Pat was saying, how does everyone meet more than halfway? The parish priests at the synod were saying, sometimes we do ask the people, and they'll say, no, Father, you can do it. And other times, priests were saying, we have a discernment process. And other times they were saying, I need to learn a discernment process. We will all be humble in this, but I wonder what it will mean as we engage the local church more as well. And it goes both ways. Others. Elizabeth Davis, please.
Thanks, Maria. First, I would want to thank the three presenters and you for giving us a good overview of what we're going to be presenting to the Synod, and I'm very deeply appreciative of that. I am a voting delegate at the Synod, and therefore I have been meeting with numerous groups in the English-speaking world, talking about my experience at the Synod and naming the themes that are in the synthesis document. I show one slide as part of a large slide deck that constantly, in every presentation I've made, has gotten a response. And that is two images. One image is the Synod Hall, where we are all sitting together in circles. The other is the last Mass of the Synod, where we're all lined up according to rank: cardinals, archbishops, bishops, priests, and lay people. The last Mass, not the first, was the first Mass as well, but in the last Mass. And my concern is that there is a fundamental issue here that I have no idea how we're going to break through. And it's manifested in the subordinate role of women in our church, in our exclusion of members of LGBTQ plus communities, and in our treatment of Earth, our subordination of Earth, our dominance of Earth. And all of that is rooted in a church that since the 3rd century, 4th century, has been dominated by white, privileged, hierarchical, patriarchal power. And until we name that, admit to that, and begin to break that down, I'm not sure as a church, despite all the good things that are happening all around the world, that we're going to change our church and have that transformation that each of our presenters named and spoke to so strongly and passionately. And we're one of the last major churches in the world that it maintains that power base. So that's what troubles me. How can we get that message to the Synod floor to provide the kind of leadership that you three of you spoke to?
That's an important point. I think Sister Sylvette was trying to engage us in looking at what are those spaces and who's in those spaces and where do we need to listen. And that listening that then flows into action as well. I'm going to invite, do we have any French or Spanish to be read
En
for us?
français, il y a
So
une
we have other
petite
readers.
question. Oui, en français, une question. Il y a d'autres commentaires, mais la question est-ce possible en faire un document qui pourrait servir d'appui de discernement et d'amélioration pour les membres de nos instituts et autres?
Yeah. I'm aware that some individuals, but also I'm aware of one conference of religious that is developing such a document to share with the church at large. So I think what we'll begin to see is numerous publications and articles and processes that will offer different ways of undertaking discernment. There isn't one way only. So I think what you're asking for is beginning to emerge, and certainly here at UISG, I can promise we will try and collect any such resources that emerge and have them translated so that they can be used by whomsoever they would be useful for.
Thank you. And certainly one of the resources for discernment are the different congregations and charisms. And to offer that even at the local level is the invitation, is to say, how do we, in our particular ways, and what is it that we offer? So at the Synod, certainly they're looking at, and we're using conversation in the Spirit as a very dominant method for the discernment so that we have a way in common, but it's not going to be the only way. And even groups that would see themselves as Ignatian or Franciscan, in our congregations, we have our own nuances for this as well. And so that's the gift. What is that Augustinian way? Where's the Sister of Charity way that we can bring in there? And I think the church is trying to offer that. And again, even as the church is using right now, and at UISG, we are trying to bring forth more and more training on conversation in the Spirit. How do we use this, and what are the different ways? It's going to be offered everywhere. And in there, we look at the different charisms and what they offer. So for example, Dominicans have an element in their tradition that's disputatio. How do you look at things with different perspectives and find a way forward? How do you listen more deeply, and what can we learn from the charisms that have that? So it's really looking at where are the peripheries and who are the people that find their ways in this. And we'll need everyone. So we will at UISG try to bring those pieces forth. I think many of you in this, and I'm aware of time, many of you are talking about how do we use our gifts? How do women and men use their gifts in the church? And I think one of the pieces in here is to notice the gifts in one another. Notice the gifts in our brothers, in our sisters, those in our congregations, but beyond it. Many of us do what we do because someone noticed, because someone invited us. And so how do we also offer that? And that's the invitation. Some of you were asking, how do we get a copy of this document? And again, as we said in the beginning, we are waiting for the instrumentum laboris of the Synod office of the church to come forth. It's supposed to come out at least by the 10th of July. And so we're waiting for that. But we will post this video. We have to do some editing of this because it's in a variety of languages. And then our documents will come out just a little bit after the Synod office document comes forth, because this was our participation in something much larger, but there's something to be offered here as well. So we thank you very much for being present. It's your voices that brought forth this document. This is yours in multiple languages. This is your voice, and it's you listening to the people of God. And it says something about collaboration, that this was the men and women religious who brought this together and are very much acknowledging we need to do this together and much wider. That expansiveness of opening our tents with our brothers and sisters, with the wider laity, but also with our brother priests, our brother bishops, So it's going to stretch everyone. And there's both healing on this journey, as Sylvette mentioned, but there's also some beautiful creativity, as Pat and Mary mentioned. So we thank you for your work, your efforts. We ask you to, in your local areas, as so many of you said, we do some of this already. It's going to need a learning church, a growing church, and a growing religious life. So I want to thank you. I want to thank our technical and communication staff that made sure all of this worked well. We could not do any of this without interpreters. So we thank our friends who are always so good at helping us hear one another in many different ways. I thank you, Sister Sylvette, and Mary Barron and Pat for being here. I thank you for who were able to come in person. It's a warm day in Rome and probably in many other places where you are, whether it's early in the morning or night. So it's a lot of gratitude that we offer. We will have other things going on, but we please ask you, wait for the Synod Instrumentum Laboris to come forth. Give some time this summer to reading it, to engaging it. We're all looking forward to it. And it will be part of our preparation, not only for the delegates, but for all of us as church. The movement happens. Religious life moved with Vatican II, but also was making movements before. And so these are the places to listen because we are a global church. So I thank you all and wish you a buonasera, buenos dias for those of you in the morning in Latin America, buenos noches for those who are getting ready for sleep. And again, many thanks, many thanks. Grazie, gracias, merci, hvala lepa, obrigado, salamat po.